Have you ever wondered if your faith can be logical? If you're looking for a podcast with all the answers around faith and logic to help you defend your beliefs, then let me tell you, you've come exactly to the wrong place. But if you're looking for a show that's going to help you ask questions, challenge your beliefs, engage with logicians and theologians from the last 2,000 years, and leave you completely clueless, struggling with what to believe about the divine at all, then you've found the perfect show for you, my friend. This is a show designed to give you more questions than answers. I am Joshua Noel, and I'm just a dummy who loves God and theology and hopes to show my love for God by studying and thinking deeply about topics that people smarter than me have been thinking about for thousands of years now. All right, guys, today we are talking about another logical fallacy. This time we're jumping in with the false dilemma fallacy. If you've been following along, we've just been looking at different logical fallacies, how they have played a part in our theology and creating heresies sometimes, in combating theology, or just in our practice with the church in general, and just kind of thinking about how can understanding these fallacies help us to have better theology. And we've said before that I don't think logically you can prove there's God or come up to the exact correct theology just using logic, but I do think we can say that God and our theology should not be illogical. So if we find these fallacies, we can see what our faith should not be, and then that could help us build what our faith should be from there. So today, again, false dilemma. How I'm choosing to define that, and different people define the false dilemma fallacy different ways. Today I will be defining it as an argument that states that you must choose between two different options when there are really other options or more nuanced than what was presented. I say two, at least one time I am going to mention a time where three options are given, where maybe there's more than three. It's basically forcing an ultimatum of your mind where you have to choose one of these options, and sometimes it's just not true. You don't have to choose one of those options. There might be other ways. There might be more nuance. There might be shades of gray in between. But a lot of times it's presented to you as you have to choose one of these two. And that creates a fallacy where people choose something where maybe they don't agree with or in the first place. So here's one. You're either with me or against me. It's a popular saying, and it's usually a false dilemma. Usually you cannot be with them, and they won't then add you to their enemy list and then try to fight you as well. They'll just be mad at you. You're not with them or against them. You could be neutral. You could say, I think you both have a point. There are many stances you can take, and they might be upset at you for taking those stances, but you're not truly either with me or against me. So I'm going to go through a couple different examples. Some of these are going to be a little more charged than others, a little more controversial, but I think these are important for us to think about. So in the United States of America, we are often presented with a false dilemma when we vote. In our election season, we talk about you have to either vote Democrat or Republican. Of course, there are other parties. There's other ways to vote. You can actually refrain from voting. You don't have to vote. And that in itself is a voice. You are voicing that you don't think either of these options are valid. So saying you have to vote either Democrat or Republican is a false dilemma. And to double up on those false dilemmas, a lot of times people, if you have a lot of friends who are all Republican or all Democrat, what they'll say is if they're all Democrat, they'll be like, well, if you don't vote, you're basically voting for the Republican Party. That's not true. You're not voting. You're not doing either party. And both sides will say it. If you have friends on both sides, your Democrat friends, well, you're basically voting for the Republicans. The Republicans, well, you're basically voting for the Democrat. In reality, you're just not voting. So that false dilemma just doesn't work. It's either heaven or hell. That also could be a false dilemma. At the end of our lives, we could be wrong as Christians. Maybe there is no afterlife. Maybe we were wrong about hell existing. There's a lot of Christian thought that says hell doesn't exist. I myself kind of am close to that camp. I'm not sure what hell is. I don't think that people are likely to be tortured forever by a loving God. That doesn't seem to make sense to me. So there can be nuance in our theology there. You're either annihilated at death, you're completely gone, or you move on to a better place. So whenever someone dies, it's all good because either they're going somewhere better or they're annihilated. Hell is still an option. They could be tortured forever. So that's another false dilemma that's presented dealing with death as well. A popular one right now is AI, artificial intelligence. A lot of people seem to think that it's going to doom humanity. A lot of people think it's going to save all of us, and it's kind of presented as it's either our savior or doom. Which side are you on? Are you pro or anti artificial intelligence. And maybe you're like, hey, I think it can be helpful in some ways and not helpful in other ways. It's a false dilemma. Science or religion? That's a big one right now. Shout out to Pastor Will. Follow him on literally anything if you want to hear more about this one. But a lot of times it's presented that either you like science, which means, you believe evolution, you believe certain stuff about reproductive rights because you can follow the science on that, go, okay, this is where life starts, whatever. Or you're religious, which means you're against evolution. You're against all of these scientific methods where we're using stem cells and research and all that stuff. But that is a false dilemma. There are a lot of scientists who, even some scientists that worked on the God particle, that go to church. They go to Pastor Will's church. There are people who believe in evolution that are Christian evolutionists. You have people who believe in science that don't believe in evolution or don't believe in some of these things. There is nuance. You don't have to choose either science or religion. You can choose neither. You can choose both. It is not a true dilemma. Do not fall for that argument. It is not true. Do research. Look up there. There are many different stances. There's actually books on like 5 different stances on creation and evolution. And I think these are worth pursuing. If you've never heard of this, go to Biologos. Look up these books. Go to, I can't think of another good website. Go to Biologos. And you'll see that there are positions that hold both of these together or deny both of these. And I think it's worth knowing they exist so that you can form your own opinion from an educated stance rather than saying, oh, I have to choose either science or religion. Nope, that's not true. It's not true. So just know the other options. Either you believe in God or you don't. You're saved or you're not. That's an argument that's often thrown out there. But even if you look in the Bible, a lot of times it seems like people are unsure. Like, wait a minute, I think I believe in God, but sometimes Job's like, you know what, I could just curse God and die. Sometimes people are not so black and white. The Bible is actually hard to pull example. People tend to just believe in God, and sometimes they turn their back on God, but they tend to just believe in God. But in real life, a lot of people, myself included, sometimes it's like, yeah, I believe in God, and then there's days that you're like, I don't know, man. Why would God let me go through this? I personally, for those who don't know, went through a car accident where I should not have lived. And a lot of the times, it's, wow, I shouldn't have lived. It was a miracle. Even the other guy's lawyer said it was a miracle. That's a cool witness and it actually makes me believe in God even more. I have such a strong faith. But just being honest, sometimes I'm like, I have to live this whole life with chronic pain now. I have to deal with these headaches every time it storms. My leg bothers me. And it's like, if there's a God, why would he make me live like this? And that makes me question, is there a God? So yeah, usually I believe there's a God. I do believe that Christ died and rose again for my sin. But I also doubt it. I don't know that for complete certain. It's not a 100% I'm certain I believe. I'm pretty sure. It's not, there is no dilemma. There is not, you believe in God or you don't. You can be pretty certain of God. You can be pretty certain there isn't a God, but open to the idea. There is nuance, even in whether or not you believe in God. All right, here's my fun example. You guys know I love doing nerdy stuff like this. I'm going Doctor Who, Peter Capaldi with the Zygon invasion of Earth. Such a good couple of episodes. If you like Doctor Who and nerdy stuff, this is like, you can watch these 2 episodes on their own and you will not regret it. But if you don't, I'm going to break down what this is about. That weird looking alien in the middle, if you're watching on YouTube, is called a Zygon. It is a shapeshifter, can make itself look like anything, retain the memories, etc., etc., If you've seen sci-fi before, you've probably seen something similar to it, the Skrull and Marvel, etc. Anyway, they can make themselves look like any person they want, so they do. They're invading Earth. There's an all-out war between the humans and the Zygons on Earth. And at one point, the Doctor wipes people's memories. They're not sure, 100% sure if they're human or if they're Zygon, what's going on. And there's all these different factors play. But the important part that I want to get to is there's 2 different parts of this war. They both have a box with a button. That might eliminate the other side of the war completely. They can just win the war. It also might eliminate themselves completely. And they can't be certain what's going to happen with this button. And they're like, Doctor, this isn't a game. What are you doing? He's like, you're right. It's not a game. That's the point. And he uses logic to show that war itself is usually a false dilemma. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys, so we have to kill them. Or maybe the other side's right, and they're the good guys and we're the bad guys, so they have to kill us. And what the doctor shows is, no, man, y'all, it is so much messier than that. And he is this incredible speech. I'm not going to read it off, but I will say the part that really always gets me, he talks about a war that he was a part of in his own world and how his own actions led to children screaming in the streets, dying, mothers dying, innocent people dying, because that's what happens in war. And he makes the statement of like, in the end, that's what war is. You don't know whose children, you don't know whose mothers are screaming, are dying. And that's what war is. And he points out, you want to make it so clean that we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, let's go bomb them. But when you really think about it, you don't know who it is that you're killing. So this false dilemma doesn't work. And that's what all war, according to the doctor, is really based on, is this false dilemma that they're the bad guys and we're the good guys. But if you really dig a little bit deeper, you see that that's not true, and innocent lives are lost because of this logical fallacy being enacted in real time. All right, moving on from my nerdy stuff. I love the doctor. I had to go there. When I watched the episode, if you go to YouTube and you watch that speech, for me, it gives me chills. I'm like, oh, it is so powerful. So good. But I do want to move on to some other stuff. We're going to talk about some practical theology and how is this practical? Understanding the false dilemma. How is that useful to you, listener, or to me? Learning to doubt and think for yourself. It's how you grow. If everything is black and white, if everything is I'm right, they're wrong, if everything is Republican or Democrat, abortion or reproduction rights, if you boil everything down to that, you will never grow. You'll just be certain that you're right and the other side's wrong, or that they're right and you're wrong, and you can never actually think of a true solution until you begin to see that there are other options out there. There doesn't have to be a full, and hey, I know this is a little bit political, but hey, I think this is worth thinking about. It doesn't have to be either a full ban on abortion, point blank, no matter what happened, how young someone is, whether it's going to cost the mother's life or not, or everything goes, it doesn't matter, we'll just kill the baby the day it's born even. I mean, there is no dilemma there. There is nuance. There is, hey, there's shades of like, when is this okay, when is it not okay? This is something we should be thinking about when it's abortion. We shouldn't be painted as a dilemma. Are you pro-choice or pro-life? It's not. I like choice and life. I think there's some common sense approaches that we could take, that we could come together and agree on some things other than creating this false dilemma and screaming at each other on the TV. I think we can love people better when we stop othering people. That's what the doctor was getting at. That's what makes war okay, because we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. And that's just the false dilemma. It's oh, you're either Christian or you're not a good person. You're either American or you're not. I mean, like, these false dilemmas allow us to create other people as just bad guys. It's just people we don't have to care about. We other them, and that makes it harder to see them as real humans that we can love. You know, if we see people who support pro-choice and we're just like, oh, well, they're just trying to kill babies, and that's all we can see them as, that dehumanizes them, and it's harder to love them as we should. We see people who believe in the Islam faith, who are Muslim, and they're the bad guys. How can we love them? Someone who disagrees with me on biblical inerrancy. You know, I don't believe in biblical inerrancy, but a lot of people do, and they'll say, if you don't believe in it, then you don't really believe in God, and you don't really believe in Jesus. That's a false dilemma, by the way. You can not believe in biblical inerrancy and still believe most of the Bible is true, including the Jesus stuff. So that's a false dilemma that's presented a lot, and it's used to other people. We use these false dilemmas to say that you're wrong, you're the bad guy, you have bad theology, you have this, you have that, whatever. We other them, and then we don't have to love them the way that God commands us to love them. And that's what happens a lot of time with these false dilemmas. And that's where I think this is practical. If we stop doing this and we look for the nuance, we try to understand people's real stance instead of just black and white everything, we can love people better. We have to listen better and question more. If I meet someone who disagrees with me and we'll say that I'm pro-choice, and someone's like, well, I don't agree with abortion. And I'm like, oh, so you just want women to die who are going to have babies, or you want 12-year-olds who are raped, and throwing out all these terrible accusations. If I stop instead and I listen, okay, wait a minute, why don't you agree with this? What happens in these scenarios? What do you think about this? And I question people, and I get to know their stance for what it really is, instead of othering them and creating these false dilemmas, I can love them better. We can grow as people when we learn to doubt. We can love people better when we stop othering them, and the church can finally be united as it's supposed to be. Yes, this is a secret whole church episode. Everybody get united, hashtag one church, whatever. But no, for real, that's how the church pursues unity. By stop othering people, by stop creating these false dilemmas, or as we're going to talk about in the next episode, these hasty generalizations of other groups. Okay, we'll look at some biblical theology. In the book of Job, Job's friends make very similar arguments to some of these we're talking about with the false dilemmas. Job's friends do this whole thing of, either you sinned or your parents sinned. Turns out neither was true, but they painted a false dilemma. They made it black and white. Either you sinned or your parents sinned. None of this bad stuff would be happening unless someone sinned, so it must be one of these two things. And they kept trying to break down, was it you? Was it your parents? Was it you? Was it your parents? It was neither. But they couldn't see that because they fell for this logical fallacy that blinded them to what was really happening. So they couldn't see what God was really trying to do here. Same thing is true. There's a guy who's brought to Jesus who was born blind or lame or something. I forget. He was disabled. He was born disabled. Remember, I'm just a dummy. I can't remember stories. You can't expect that of me. He was born disabled, and he was brought to Jesus. And the disciples were like, why was he born this way? Did he sin or did his parents sin? And Jesus was like, neither. There's a whole nother reason. It was for my glory. And people were blinded to what was really happening because of this false dilemma that they created. Was it their sin or their parents' sin? Sometimes it's not sin at all. Sometimes bad stuff just happens. All right, here we go. Hagar and Ishmael. For those who remember their biblical stories, that is Abram. He had a child with his servant, sort of. Long story. Don't want to get into it. Go listen to whatever episode of Let Nothing Move You by Christian Ashley where he talks about this story. It's in Genesis somewhere. Just listen to all of his Genesis episodes. Anyway, Hagar, sort of servant, not really. Abram's wife, Sarai? I don't know how you say that. I'm still going to say Sarah. Abram's wife, Sarah, was like, hey, go into her, have a child. That'll be the heir. God promised you, like all these people. This is how we'll make it happen. He goes into her. He has a child. They name it Ishmael. And then Sarah gets angry. He's like, well, you got to kill her now. I'm over it. And the story presents it where you think that either Ishmael's supposed to be that promised child that God was talking about, or Abram's going to have to kill both of them. They're cursed. But instead what happens is neither of those things. God says, hey, for Sarah's sake, cast them out. But I'm going to bless them still. They weren't cursed. They weren't killed. They weren't the promise either. There was a different thing that no one could see what God was doing. Because again, false dilemmas get in the way to see what God's doing. So stop creating these false dilemmas. Pray, have your eyes open, and look for what God's really doing. Don't create these binaries that aren't really there. All right, on to the... It's finally that time in our logical fallacy series to talk about some heresies. So, first up, and do know I will be mispronouncing all of these because I'm a dummy. Nestorianism, that is the belief that Christ's divine and human natures are separate. Of course, this was founded by Nestorius, which is why it's called Nestorianism. Again, mispronouncing all of this. Don't care. I'm a dummy. You guys were warned up front. So, this is the idea. I am a human. By very nature of me, if you took away everything else, my soul is a human soul. And I am encapsulated in a human body. So in a lot of these arguments, you're going to have to distinguish between natures and roles. So just like I have a role at my job as a cook or as a manager or whatever, or just as I have a role as a son to my parents, a husband to my wife, etc. Those are my roles. My nature is human. So a lot of times these arguments get split up as Christ has a human nature or a divine nature or both natures or one nature that is both, whatever, which is what he is, his soul. If you stripped away all the flesh and bones and muscle and stuff, that's what Jesus is. That's his nature. And then you also have these arguments of roles. Does he play the role of human, but he is the divine being playing the role of human? Or is he both, where he has a human role and a God role that he plays whenever he dies on the cross? Does he have both roles? Does he have both natures? Mixed match. That's where a lot of these heresies and debates in some of the early church, and by that I mean like the 500s, 600s, 700s, 800s, really kind of go down to some of these stuff. So, Nestorianism say that Christ had both a divine and a human nature. They are separate. They are not the same, but they are both encapsulated in the body of Jesus. The reason they held on to this belief is because, well, human nature can't not sin, divine nature can't sin. So if Christ came from Mary, Mary is a human, then he would inherit sin, because they believe in this idea of original sin. The church at that time, most of the church today still believes it, which is basically this idea that humans are tainted by sin by very nature, and as soon as we are born, sin is part of the human nature. So Christ must also have a divine nature that is not tainted by that, which is where, it talks about like the Holy Spirit comes onto Mary and then she is conceived with child. There's a lot of weird stuff you could read into that or not read into that, whatever. We're going to leave that alone. We're just going to say that if you believe that sin is passed down through blood, then there are some problems with this idea of Christ's human nature. If you're going to also say that he had to be perfect to make that sacrifice that atoned for everyone's sins, if that's the atonement theory you go with, there's a lot of ifs here. But basically, because that penal substitutionary kind of model, or that atonement model that requires a perfect sacrifice, any of the models that require a perfect sacrifice, don't mesh with the idea that Christ was human and all humans are also sinful by nature. So someone had to come up with some nice ways around some of this. Nestorius' idea was that he also had a divine nature that was completely perfect. So when he died and rose again, the divine nature is what came back, not necessarily the human nature. So the perfect thing still died and came back, and that's how we have the sacrifice, even though he was human. This was declared heresy at the Council of Ephesus. And again, all of these occur because of this false dilemma. I'm going to go through the other ones before I kind of explain why I believe that. So the next one I want to talk about is Monophytism. Again, mispronouncing. Christ only had a divine nature. He didn't have a human nature because human natures are sinful, so he couldn't have had one of those because he wasn't sinful. This was declared heresy at the Council of Chalcedon. That's also being pronounced wrong. All right. Patripassianism. That's one. That's something. Patripassianism? Okay, anyway. The Father was with the Son at the cross suffering. So the three aren't totally separate in the Trinity. They can't be. So when Christ died on the cross, so did God. God also died. The Father, that is. I know, confusing. Trinity stuff is confusing. I won't say it's not. We will probably do an episode on it at some point. But all three of these comes down to this inability to understand past the dilemma that either Christ was perfect and he was the perfect sacrifice, or he was human and thus sinned by his nature and thus could not be the perfect sacrifice. That's the dilemma being presented, that all three of these are trying to address, that either Christ was perfect and he was the perfect sacrifice that we needed for our sins, or he was not perfect and thus his sacrifice didn't mean anything. Instead of saying, maybe he had a human nature and didn't sin. Maybe original sin is wrong. Maybe our ideas of how atonement works is wrong. There's other atonement theories out there that don't require a perfect sacrifice. There are all kinds of different doctrines, ideas, theologies that could be developed to explain how Christ was both divine and human, came down, died, and rose again, and in some meaningful way, somewhere along that experience, atoned for our sins. There are lots of different ways of viewing this and thinking about this, but because it's usually presented as one or the other, these other ideas came up that are heretical because they're trying to deny either Christ's divine or human nature. And I personally would rather you disagree with me on how atonement works or disagree with me on, any number of the other things of does the sacrifice have to be perfect, or are humans born with original sin? Let's disagree on those things rather than disagreeing on whether or not Jesus was both divine and human. Jesus had to be both divine and human as part of the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed that I fully believe in. So let's disagree on the other things rather than creating this dilemma that doesn't need to exist. So I think this false dilemma is what led to all three of these major heresies in the church of Nestorianism, mispronounced, Monophytism, mispronounced, and Patripassianism, definitely mispronounced. So those are just some heresies that may have occurred because of the false dilemma. I also want to talk about some of the church's history with iconoclasts, because this also occurs, in my belief, because of false dilemma fallacies. So iconoclast You're going to see this in the Byzantine church around 700s, 800s. What happened where people said use of image in worship meant that people were choosing to worship the images instead of God. So we're just going to have to destroy all the images and all the statues, and they went to destroy the icons, thus iconoclast. So here's the false dilemma I think to do it. They're saying you're either worshiping these images or statues, or you're worshiping God. Rather than saying, wait, maybe people are using these images, these statues to think about the things of God and are worshiping God and just using this art to engage in it, just like we do with worship music, right? We hear the music. We're not necessarily worshiping the person singing or the instruments or anything like that. We are worshiping God and using art to kind of channel and help us focus on different things about God. So I think that is another false dilemma that's been presented that's caused a lot of grief and pain. And even in the church today, you'll see different churches that are like, oh man, you can't have statues, or that use statues poorly, or use them. Like a lot of churches will say that churches that have images or statues of saints or icons of different leaders in the church are actually worshiping them and they're sinners and they do just worship Jesus. This false dilemma still exists in the church today, is what I'm trying to say. It caused a lot of pain in the 700s and 800s, and it still causes a lot of pain today when people pursue this kind of false dilemma logic to disclude part of the church that has a very rich, deep history and loves Jesus dearly, and usually has pretty similar theology to the people who are calling them non-Christians. I think if we saw nuance and we could engage with each other better, learning to hold ideas with a loose hand might help us from arguing ourselves into heresy with a false dilemma. It might keep us from missing out on modes of worship. You know, there are parts of the church that don't believe in using instruments because, oh, that's not what was said in this part of the Bible, so we must not be able to use instruments during worship. Whether it's statues, icons, music, false dilemma often keeps us from seeing different ways we might be able to engage in worship. It causes us to make choices that maybe are terrible theologies because we created this false dilemma and we think that that's the only choice, only way out. We have to see past these dilemmas. Also, I'm going to throw out one more. You guys know I love C.S. Lewis, but he makes the argument, and this is a trilemma, not a dilemma, but I still think it falls under the same thing. Yeah, I'm just going to go with that. He says that Christ was either a liar, a lunatic, or he was Lord. As much as I love C.S. Lewis, here's why I think that is a false trilemma, same fallacy. Because he's trying to say that either Jesus, when he said that I am God, I am this, that he was lying, or he was crazy and really believed he was God, or he just was God. That is the trilemma that Lewis presents. However, here are some other options. Jesus never said that. Whoever wrote down that he said that, and they're liars, not Jesus. He could both be crazy and Lord. He could be God, and God could just be crazy. We don't know. He could be saying that we all are the Son of God or gods, and expanding that to everyone. There are many other options. I don't believe in them. I believe that Jesus was God. He was Lord. But I think that argument, that trilemma setup, is not a good argument. It's something that we should avoid making because there are certainly several other options there that aren't liar, lunatic, or Lord. Sorry, C.S. Lewis, I love you. Please forgive me. All right, with that, let's move on to some systematic theology. Just talking about some implications on our other doctrines that come out of some of the stuff we talked about today. Obviously, ecclesiology, top of the list. When we other people with this dilemma of you're either this or that, you either believe this or you don't believe this, you're either in or out of the church. These false dilemmas provide divisions in the church, keeps us from unity. So that's affecting our ecclesiology or the theology of the church. Eschatology. That's the end times. That's where you get that hellfire preaching. Oh, you're going to burn in hell forever. Oh, if you don't change your ways. Again, we don't know for sure hell exists. We don't know for sure if it does exist, it's not just annihilation. We could be wrong about whatever you believe. Me, I kind of fall more on that universalist thing where I think eventually everyone will be saved. But I could be wrong. Hell could be real. And I think a little bit of humility here rather than this hellfire preaching of, oh, you're going to burn if you don't change your ways. Or my way of just being like, hey, it's fine, it's whatever. I don't think either of those are right. Let's have some humility. Let's say, hey, maybe hell does exist. What I do know for sure is that I think your life right now would be better with God in it. And if hell does exist, I don't want to go there, right? But that shouldn't be the motive, I think. That whether or not hell does exist, I still think our motive should be to pursue God because he makes life here better now. That being with him is better than being without him. So whether or not hell exists, I would like you to be with God. And the only way to do that is through Jesus Christ, who died and rose again for all of us. So I think our eschatology, how we talk about the end times, how we talk about whether or not hell exists, is impacted by this. Because if we see this dilemma, then you're either going to hell or you're not going to hell. Hell exists or it doesn't. This whole thing is worth it or not worth it. Well, there's reasons Christianity is worth it whether or not hell's real, in my opinion. There are reasons to believe that hell exists. There are reasons to believe hell does not exist. There are reasons to not care if it exists or not. Let's get rid of this false dilemma out of our preaching. Then we got to talk about some theology proper. When I say theology proper, I just mean God himself. Does God exist? We can't know for certain. That is just a thing. We don't really know for sure that God's there. I believe that it is better to act as though he is because I believe God is love. And a life of love, whether or not God is real, is a life worth living. So, get that dilemma out of the way. Let's come up with some reasons why we believe in God and what happens if we're wrong. That's a thing worth pondering, worth thinking about, that we can't think about if we hold on to this dilemma that we have. And if we don't allow people, here's my thing, if we don't allow people the grace to doubt God, they're going to feel like, well, maybe I'm not really saved because sometimes I'm not sure there's a God. Let's get rid of that language of you believe or you don't believe. Let's stop making people think that they're not really saved. Like, that's stupid. Or, hey, a lot of people can't commit to being Christian because, like, well, I mean, if I had to know for sure, well, I'll never know for sure because what about this? What about this? What about evolution? What about this? Tell me, I mean, no, you actually don't have to know for sure there's a God. I don't know for sure. That's fine. Let's talk about why I think it's good to act as though God does exist. Why I think Jesus is someone worth following regardless. Let's discuss these things. And it's okay if you doubt, and it's okay if you can never commit for sure because you don't know. Doubting, uncertainty, these things are okay. Let's stop presenting a dilemma when we talk about God in general. Just war theory. Here's another one. We talked about it earlier with the doctor of war as we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. It's both a false dilemma and a hasty generalization. Again, come back next time. But that just war theory of that Augustine and then later Thomas Aquinas, I don't like Thomas Aquinas, but Augustine, I like Augustine's. They have this theory, and the way they come up with it is war is permissible, not something that we should desire, but permissible if we actually, by doing war, we are saving someone who is being enslaved, or if we are saving more lives than we're taking, that kind of stuff. There are reasons that maybe war can be justified under certain things for Christians. And I think there's a little bit of nuance there. That's not just killing is bad or killing is good. That they were able to see because they didn't fall for this false dilemma. Augustine saw past that and tried to develop a more nuanced theology, whether you agree with it or not. And I think this is a really good showing of why we need to avoid false dilemmas, because that's when we get these good theological doctrines and ideas that are fleshed out. Because we're able to see past, is killing bad or good? All right, guys, as always, you know, we like to end with 3 takeaway questions. So today I got 3 good ones for you. We don't have takeaway actions. We have takeaway questions. This is stuff that for you to go home and study, ponder on your own, rather than stuff for you to just go do. As you know, I don't give you answers. I give you questions. That's what we do on the show. So here we go. One more. Number 1 is, what kind of worship might have you turned away from because of a false dilemma you created in your head? So might art or statue or music be something that's useful to you, but you haven't engaged in this worship because you create this false dilemma of, oh, they're worshiping the art instead of God. All right, that's number 1. Number 2, what conversations could you navigate better if you did not jump to conclusions based off of false dilemma in your head? Might you have better conversations about whether or not evolution is true, whether or not we should be pro-life or pro-choice, whether or not war is permissible? Could you navigate conversations better if you got rid of some of your false dilemma thinkings? All right, and then number 3, how has false dilemmas prevented people in your church from loving their neighbors better? Have you othered people? Have you created the other because of your false dilemmas? Or are you loving your neighbor as someone with nuanced, different opinions than yourself. So those are 3. One more time. What kind of worship might have you turned away from because of a false dilemma you created in your head? Number 2, what conversations could you navigate better if you did not jump to conclusions based on a false dilemma? And then number 3, how has false dilemmas prevented people in your church from loving their neighbors better? Just some things for you to take home and question, think about on your own. Guys, I hope you are all just as confused as I am, and that you're inspired to think deeper, to learn from the church's past, to think deeper about these kind of questions of logical fallacies, to challenge your own beliefs, reject heresies that may be based on fallacies like the false dilemma fallacy going forward in your own faith journeys. Thank you all so much for joining this dummy on my journey to learn more about God and to love him better. And I hope this has encouraged you to worship God in your own thinking, and of course, to keep on struggling.